As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Welcome to the 7th episode in my season of Summer Shorts, a series of shorter episodes where you'll hear from writers working in the trenches right alongside you. Each week, they'll share their fears, doubts, and questions they have about the craft of writing and their writing lives. Consider it your backstage pass to my coaching practice. This week, you'll hear from Laurie Riedman, a personal and relationship coach, writer, and storyteller. She published her memoir, Diamonds in the Dirt, Stories from a Junkyard Girl, earlier this year. She also co-edited Badass Sisterhood and Soulshine, which is forthcoming with Susan Walter. During this episode, Laurie and I talk about 3 issues trauma survivors struggle with: owning their truths, dealing with family responses, and navigating the unexpected anxieties that come from sharing your writing with others, and especially with publishing a memoir that explores personal trauma. But before we get to our conversation, I have a few questions for you. What struggles have you had, or can you imagine having as you get closer to publishing your memoir or any other personal writing? Has sharing your work with others ever triggered you? If so, how'd you care for yourself? I hope you'll ponder these questions as you listen along. Now let's get to my conversation with Laurie Riedman. Hey, writers, have you written a draft or two of a memoir only to feel completely lost? Do you wonder what the story really is or how to structure it? Or have you received competing advice from some people who love certain parts of your story while others don't? Or worst of all, have you been ghosted by agents and editors or received the cryptic, great writing, but just not for us email? Most writers think the answer is diving deeply into their pages. But to figure out what's missing, what needs to be retooled, and what needs to be tossed, you need a bird's eye view of your manuscript. That's what I'll provide in Camp Structure, my proven program that will help you understand how stories work, decide what parts of your life actually belong in your book, and develop a clear path through the revision landmines most memoirists face. As a member of Camp Structure, you'll benefit from expert coaching, membership in a motivated cohort, monthly Ask Me Anything office hours, and instruction that will help you finish this book and the next one. So if you want to feel confident about the story you're telling, clarity around how to write it, and the focus needed to get the job done, sign up for Camp Structure by clicking on the link in the show notes. Camp begins on Tuesday, September 10th, which will be here before you know it, so be sure to grab your spot. Well, hello, Laurie. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I am so grateful to see you again, and it is lovely to have you on.
It's great to be here, Lisa. Thanks.
Well, last we met, though we've had some conversations on email, you were working on a book as part of my Camp Structure class, and looky behind you. Your book has been published, and I have my copy right here of Diamonds in the Dirt. So, my first question is going to be, what would you like us to know about you and your book?
Well, I'm a personal and relationship coach, but I'm also a writer. I had a 30-year career of writing professionally. And a couple years ago, actually more than a couple, I decided to do some writing for fun and decided to take a memoir class. It just happened to be what I could fit into my schedule, never intending to write a memoir. And I had a kind of unique childhood growing up in a junkyard. I also experienced trauma, as I know you have as a
Yeah.
child. And I've heard you say, Lisa, that writing for you is such an important part of like healing journey for
Yeah.
trauma. And I found that the more I wrote the stories from my childhood, the more I remembered.
Hmm.
And it just got to the point where I had enough stories and the pandemic hit and work came down. And I decided maybe it was time to pull the book together and joined your class. And you helped me do that.
And I love how you have your book in the background.
Yeah.
Such great product placement. And for all of you who are listening, and at some point you're going to have a book published, you want to make sure whenever you're on a podcast or you have any other speaking engagement that your book is available so that it's in people's minds. And I love your cover. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. That I worked with a cover designer and it was really wonderful to get her insights.
What did you learn from that process?
Well, it was interesting. I had in my head a particular idea for a cover, and I had
Mhm.
originally hired an illustrator because I have no pictures of myself as a child, very few. And so I went through that process, paid money to have someone work with me, and in the end, it just didn't feel right.
Mm,
So one of my writing groups I'm in had a graphic designer that lives near where I live come in and talk about book design. And so I hired her and worked with her, and I learned a lot about what catches people's eye. She taught me how to really, we all judge a book by its cover, right?
we
So
do.
she helped me through that process, and I'm very grateful for her. And on my website, I do have a credit to her if people want to look her up.
Nice. And I'm interested because it relates to the question that you're going to share with us in a moment. You said that the original person that you worked with, it wasn't working out. Something just didn't feel right. What was that like for you? And what internal guidance or signals did you have that just said, I don't think this is a good fit?
Well, it was really me because I had this idea in my head of what the cover should look like, and I am not an artist. And she's won awards for book covers, illustration, and she's an
Hmm.
amazing artist in my community. But it just seemed as though I was forcing something to happen. It felt like there was
Mm-hmm.
resistance inside of me. It didn't feel true to myself. And I just was worried that I couldn't put a child on the cover because I didn't have any pictures of me.
Mm.
But once I really got working with the designer, she really kind of asked me questions like, what kind of mood did I want the cover to show? She had read parts of the book too, so she knew a little bit about the book. And it's funny, the cover that we chose is a picture of a little girl swinging. And I actually did a focus group since I'm in marketing with not kind of informally and asked people what they thought of the cover. And a couple people came back and thought they didn't like that it showed a little bit of the little girl's underwear
Mm.
because it's an innocent thing on a swing.
Yeah.
But I really liked that picture because it kind of foreshadows a little bit of the trauma in the book, but in a
Mm-hmm.
very innocent way.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of fuzzed out part of the picture to kind of take in the feedback from the focus group.
Yeah, I love that you were able to have a focus group so you could get some feedback. I think that's so important when you are working through cover design or, some of the other more aesthetic parts of the writing process and, that are marketing focused because yes, we do judge books by their covers and they need to be really good. And what I'm hearing from this experience is that, this isn't about the person that you worked with. They were very talented. They
Yes.
knew what they were doing. They've won awards. And yet you knew that what the work you were going to do was not going to be true to your vision. And so somehow you were able to trust yourself. And I want you to hold that in your
Yeah.
mind as we get into the question that you came here to ask.
Yes. Yes. And this is a question that's close to my heart. And I think hopefully it will be of interest to a lot of people that follow, your clients and people who follow your podcast. So my question is that when writing a memoir or creative nonfiction, particularly of our own life,
Mhm.
especially if it includes some type of trauma, and I kind of call that big T or little t, to
Yeah.
me, it's all trauma. Do you have any advice for us on how to get past or quiet that little voice inside that says what we're saying isn't true?
Hmm. Yeah, that is a really good question and it's one I get asked a lot. So I'm so glad that you asked it and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on in addition to the fact that you are one of my former students. So I'm going to pull back here for a second and talk about the general ways that this works so that anyone who's listening can say, "Oh, maybe this is me or this is
Mhm.
me." And then as you're listening, I want you to think about what's ringing true for you so we can talk about that. So, in terms of our ability to trust whether or not what's on the page is actually true, the issue can come from two places. So, there can be external things happening out in the world, usually with other people, family members, other people who might serve as main characters, wanting to know about your work, putting
Mhm.
pressure on you to portray them in different ways. And so those things can be very triggering. And especially, in the world we live in, which can be very polarizing, even things in the news or news stories about, gotcha newscasts or somebody got in trouble for something that
Mhm.
wasn't true. All of those things can make us question our stories and whether or not they're true. And when it comes to, characters in our book, I just want to say, of course they're worried. Of course they feel uneasy about it. It is vulnerable to
Mhm.
be in someone else's book. And yet, that doesn't mean you don't have the right to tell your story. So that's some of the external things that can
Mhm.
happen. And then there's the stuff inside us. And so that can come from a number of different places. If you come from an invalidating environment, and that could be any kind of environment where you were told that your story, your experience didn't matter, or people told you that your version of what happened wasn't true. So if you've been discounted in any way, that can affect it. If you have then built a habit of discounting yourself, right? So it's like maybe someone discounted you. Now you're discounting yourself. That can affect it. Also, two other things that can affect it is memory lapses. So it's very common when we are working on memoir or other forms of creative nonfiction where it is dealing directly with our experiences that we're not going to remember everything.
Mhm.
And we're going to remember things wrong. That's because of how memory works. And there's so much I could say about that that would be outside of the scope of these summer short episodes, but memories are fallible. And when we encounter fallible memories, what can happen is that we can begin to discount our own experiences. And then this is another part that can get involved is that if we've experienced trauma, which you referenced in your question, there can be parts of us that are trying to protect us, protect our these other parts of ourselves from feeling the pain of confronting whatever's on the page. And so sometimes that those protector parts might say, no, 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 that can't be true. That can't be true. We're not going to go there because we have to face something that's really difficult. And so all of those things can be reasons why we discount our experiences and we struggle to trust that it's true. So as I share all of that, what's sticking out to you?
All of it.
It is often
Uh,
that the case for people.
I certainly had, you know, one of the things that I will say is that the more I wrote, I had gone through a lot of therapy, every kind you could
Mhm.
imagine my whole lifetime. And I really felt I was in a good place to write this and that I had done a lot of healing. What I was surprised at is, again, the more I wrote, the more I remembered. And quite frankly, it was more of the fun stuff that I had
Mhm.
totally forgotten. But after I collected the stories and put the book together, I did, in certain cases, call up various family members, other people, other characters, as you said, that were in the story to kind of just fact check. I really
Sure.
enjoy storytelling. And if those of you that hopefully will read my book, it puts you in the scene. I like doing that, even though it's memoir. And so, I was 5 years old. I didn't remember the color of the car that
Mhm.
and so I would ask people for those details. And sometimes it was very helpful, but often it contradicted completely what I'd written, like
Mm.
completely. And that shook me.
Yeah.
It made me wonder, is this true? And a big part of writing this was to own my truth,
Mhm.
was to put it out there. I didn't realize how scary it would be when I did, but to put it out there. And part of my story, one of the themes is creativity saved me.
Mhm.
I loved to read, I was in plays, and I pretended a lot. That's how I survived as a kid. So it was really important for me because of that to own my truth in this story.
Mhm.
And that's why it became really hard, because there were so many times that that little voice inside of me was saying, well, that didn't happen that way. Are you really sure?
Mm.
Like, how could you really remember that? You were only 5. And so the more I worked on the stories, it was really hard to resist taking things out,
Yeah.
changing it a lot. I did get a lot of support from really good beta readers. I did 2 different
Mhm.
rounds of beta readers, but even I mean, one of the things I thought of when you were talking just now, Lisa, is, and what prompted me to write this question to you, when I pushed the button to publish it on
Yeah.
Amazon, I've been working years for this, and I thought, I'll be jumping up and down, I'll crack open the champagne, it would be so
Mhm.
exciting. I ran to the bathroom, I almost threw up. I was
Yeah.
terrified. And I was like, what the heck? And it was this feeling that came over me of, okay, now you've done it. Everyone's going to see,
Mhm.
and this isn't true. And it was really a visceral response that I
Oh,
did not
yeah.
anticipate.
I will say, girlfriend, I have been there too. So, yeah, this experience, and I'm going to unpack this in a
Yeah.
couple of different ways, but I do want to get to the publishing piece because I think that's so important. So, one of the first things you did is some of this happens when you're very young. That's an important
Hmm.
part of the story. Pretend plays an important role. So, there is, a fictional part of the
Yes.
story because you are making things up in order to cope. And that was important. So, being able to tease out what's true, what's not was part of the story. The hard thing with siblings, and we often want to ask them because they were there, right? They're the ones who shared it in the most intimate way. And yet, each sibling is going to have their own experience, which can directly oppose yours because they're having a different experience. They
Hmm.
are not actually having the same experience, even though they might have been in the same room. Some of the things that can cause that are birth order, relationship to parents, their emotional state at the same time this thing is happening, what was important to them. Even if everybody's scared, let's say, if what matters to that person in terms of their survival might be very different from yours, or even if it's happy, what makes them happy is going to be different. So I think that is a struggle that many writers face. And so my invitation to all of you is that yes, you can ask your siblings, but if they tell you a story that is vastly different from your own, that does not mean your story is not true. And it also does not mean that their story is not true. Their memories are their memories for a variety of different reasons. And sometimes it's best to try to do that research without your siblings, especially if they are characters in your book. Because once someone is a character, and especially if they know they are a character in your book, it skews everything. So try to think about, can you research things on the internet? And obviously, if it's a color of a car, you can't necessarily, especially if there aren't pictures. And that's such a small detail. It's okay if it's not completely accurate. And you can even say in a book, in my memory, it's blue.
I had that come up, and actually, in the case about the car, I have this really specific memory of my grandmother taking me to have her hair done. Pretty much, she would have her hair done weekly,
Mm-hmm.
and we would go because she would always buy me a book afterwards. And I remembered that. And I remember like her fingernails pushing the buttons on the
Yeah.
radio, and I was in the back seat, and sometimes I'd pretend she was my chauffeur. So in that story that I have in my book, I just called my older brother Joe and I said, "Hey, what kind of car was that? Like that grandma drove?" And I just wanted that like detail. And
Mm-hmm.
he said, "Grandma didn't drive that car." And I was like, "Yes, she did." He's like, "No, that was grandpa's car. And she would have me come home from college and start it up and drive it around the neighborhood because she was
Mm.
afraid to drive it." And all of a sudden, I was like, "Oh, what happened? Like, I have this memory, Lisa." And so I kept that story in the book, and I put
Mm-hmm.
in, I think, either the preface or the prologue or somewhere, my note to readers, I shared this, that my
Mm-hmm.
brother had a different view. And what I think may have happened is maybe my mom was there driving with my
Mm.
grandmother, but I wanted so much to feel special and feel like
Yeah.
she was the chauffeur, that I made that a part of my memory.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to keep that in the book. And it was a struggle for me to go back and forth. Like, do I change it? This is my memory. But exactly what you said, I kind of came to the point where that's his experience. And
Yes.
this was my experience. And then it really made an interesting introspective, it made me really look at what is truth.
Yes. And sometimes that's what's important is, not so much is it factual, but why do we remember the things we do?
Mhm.
And how does that lead to truth? And my husband and I just recently had this experience where I have this very vivid memory and I can't even remember what it is, but I think it has to do with music and CDs. And remembering myself listening to CDs at a time when CDs didn't exist, but the memory is so vivid. I'm just like, okay, I know enough about memory to say, like, well, there's something in there that's true for me. And I think that can be really important. And so, yeah, it's owning it is important. I love that you put it early in the book. I know that Mary Carr does this a
Mhm.
lot in her book, The Liars Club. She will share a memory and then she'll put in parentheses, Lisa will tell you a different story that Lisa is her sister. So these kinds of things happen a lot. And it's important to learn how to own your truth,
Mhm.
especially when it comes to time to publish, because what can happen, and this is so interesting to me, but it also makes sense, is that we often think of publishing as this major victory. We have made it. We get to hold our books. It's amazing. And on one hand, it is. But if you are a trauma survivor and you are a person who experienced bad things when you were seen, and those bad things can be bad things happen to you, or your pain was not seen or validated. So it can be either or. The experience of publishing can be terrifying and it can create an extremely visceral reaction. So, learning how to take care of ourselves and understand that this is a normal and okay part of the process. You're not broken, you're not wrong. Your nervous system is just really trying to help you is important. So, I always tell people have a lot of self care.
Mm.
Expect that that might be the experience versus the other thing that everyone shows out on social media. There are a lot more writers out there who have the experience you had, Lori, that don't talk about it, and then they show a different experience online. So your experiences is one that a lot of people have. And what I would say is here are some invitations for how you can begin to own your own experience. So, one, it's about self talk.
Mhm.
Really learn how to say it's okay for there to be multiple truths. My story is true and it doesn't have to be factual. And I can own both on the page that the story is true and there is an emotional truth there, even if I don't remember all the facts. Also, think about where you're researching and make sure you are protecting yourself from main characters for as long as you can. And know that when you tell, main characters about your story at a variety of points, and some authors do not tell their main characters until after it's been published. I mean, that happens. And each person has to make their own decision about when they're going to do that. That's a whole different question.
Right.
But really have good boundaries. And I love what Marion Roach Smith says. She will show this to people and she'll say, tell me if something is factually inaccurate. And if it's factually inaccurate and it's valid, can be
Right.
validated that it is, she will change it. And if not, it's her story. But I think another thing that can be really helpful is to have a sense of mission, to understand how your work is of service to others, and then to work really hard in the writing process to keep your side of the street clean, meaning that you are really working to not necessarily get away from the truth or, sugarcoat things, but that you're also being compassionate to your characters. That every character is rounded. That if you're sharing something that is unflattering about someone else, you have a really good reason why you're doing it and that it serves the story. So making sure you're doing all of these things, I think can help mitigate that, but it's
Mhm.
not necessarily going to take away the discomfort. So, because we want to keep this short,
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you a question and then we're going to move on to my lightning round
Sure.
questions. I've just shared a whole lot of information. What do you want to take away that's related to your experience?
Well, when you talked about kind of making sure that what you're sharing serves the story and like
Mm-hmm.
does it need to be there, I did do that. I was able to, especially talking about family members, I was able to change certain things that maybe it wasn't exactly the way I wrote or described them in the original story, but I
Mm-hmm.
realized it wasn't serving the story
Yes.
to say those things. So that rang true for me for sure. And the self-care piece was how I got
Mm-hmm.
through that moment of pushing the publish button, I mean, I almost threw up, but I immediately
Mm-hmm.
sat down and kind of used some of my own coaching tools I kind of meditated and kind of relaxed and just kind of got my vagus nervous system kind of calm.
Yeah.
And then I went for a walk that day. I didn't tell anyone I had hit the button like I was planning to. And I wasn't going to do like a big launch thing at that time, but I decided to pull together rather quickly an online unboxing of all
Mm-hmm.
the books, because I realized that if I wasn't feeling celebratory, what did I need to feel celebratory?
Yes.
And I realized it was other people who had supported me. I want to feel this way. And so, how could I get there?
I love those strategies. I think that is a wonderful way to think about this. And I'm so glad you did that work. And I think that's one of the things that makes you a gift to others. And I think that's one of the things that makes your work such a gift to all of us. So I'm going to end with our 3 questions.
Mhm.
So, what is the best piece of writing advice that you have received?
I think it's really to write and just write without editing.
Yes.
At first I was trying to make it, all picture perfect. And I realized just writing is a process. Let it
Hmm.
flow, and then I can go back and refine it later. And I called a lot of my first, second, third drafts of stories sandpaper drafts
Oh,
because
I love that.
they were rough, but I could go back and polish them. So that's kind of the biggest advice that helped me the most, was just to write. And then I could worry about putting in the details, editing later and polishing them later. And
Oh, that's wonderful.
the other thing I thought of when you asked me that question is, there's a quote and I have it on a little sticky and I don't even know who said it. Tried to look it up before this call and I couldn't find it. But it's, writing is going deeper into the human spirit with words.
Mm, that's
And
beautiful.
you've talked so much about writing via therapy. I totally believe that. And I hope that so many others who are writing about their own childhoods or whatever they're writing about that has caused them some challenges in their life will hopefully recognize that it's just going deep inside ourselves
Hmm.
and using words to express whatever is there.
I love that. So, you just shared a bunch of different ways that you cared for yourself when you were publishing your book, when you hit the publish button. If you had one thing you want to say about how you nurture your resilience, what would that be?
Going outside in nature, watching a sunrise or a sunset. I mean, nature grounds me.
Yeah.
And it allows me to take a breath and to pause and to be in the awe and the beauty of what is in
Hmm.
front of me, and to know that I can be grounded and trust myself, and I can face whatever challenge that I'm facing, whether it's with my writing or just life.
Beautiful. And if people want to connect with you, get your book, learn more about you, follow you online, what are the best ways for them to connect?
Well, I have an author website, which is my first and last name. It's www.laurieriedman.com. And I'm sure, Lisa, you'll put that somewhere so people spell it correctly.
Yes, it will
And
be in the show notes.
on there, you can subscribe to my blog, which is on Substack, which is called More Than Words. And I do write all different kinds of writing, essays, different things, some stories from my past, some stories that didn't appear in the book. But I do a lot of writing there, and I'd love to hear from people when I post, just like you do. And people can go on to laurieriedman.com and get a link directly to the Amazon. I think because I'm a first-time author, it's a little tricky sometimes for people to find me on Amazon just using my name quite yet. So that's the best way to find the book. And there's also a link on that website to email me.
Wonderful. Well, all of those things will be in the show notes. So I hope that people connect with you,
Mm,
learn more about your experience. And I want to thank you so much for being here. And once again, congratulations both for completing Camp Structure, which is,
yes.
it's a lot to do,
Mhm.
but
It was
go
so
ahead.
helpful. It was so helpful. I was just telling someone the other day how, even though the structure that you taught, I didn't end up using completely,
Hmm.
it totally helped me really find the structure that worked for me, and telling the story with a hero's journey or through all the tools that you showed us, you can use in a short story, you could use, it doesn't have to be in a book.
Yes.
So the skills were really wonderful to learn. And I still stay in touch with people in the class.
Yay. And that's what I always love to hear. And I love how you're like, I figured out one structure, but then later on, I realized it needed to be something a little different. That is so common. And that happens to everyone. And so I love that. So I am celebrating you for all that you have done since our class. And I want to thank you once again for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing and Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.